All right, so now we are continuing our reading in Matthew, and for this week's reading, we're doing Matthew 15 to 28. So let's just start talking right off the bat about Matthew chapter 15. So there's something going on right off the bat here. The Pharisees are questioning Jesus about the hand washing because it's something that they do. And just so we kind of understand, there is no biblical rule or law that says that this is required. This is something the priests are required to do, but not everyday people. But there's a reason why the Pharisees and the religious leaders are trying to push this down on everyday people. And I'll get to that in a little bit later in Matthew, because it comes up again. So there's no biblical order for this. And what Jesus kind of fires back with is the calling out of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He does this because he's kind of calls them out for not taking care of their mothers and fathers. And he does this because they're doing something, it's a practice called Corban, Corban. I probably didn't pronounce it right. But this is a practice where people give up all their possessions and give it away in the name of God, which on the surface is a wonderful thing. It can be a really great thing. However, the intent behind what they're doing is they're doing this so they do not have to materially take care of their mother and father. So by doing that, they're not honoring their mothers and fathers. So Jesus is calling them out on this hypocrisy. You know, you're holding up these traditional purity laws more than you're holding up the law of God, which is, it's one of the 10 Commandments, right? To honor the mother and father. And so Jesus uses this as a way to kind of call them out on their hypocrisy. This is a good challenge for us individually, collectively as a church. Where are the little traditions that we have or little expectations we have that we maybe place on people when they come through our doors or in our church? The kind of clothes you have on or what you're expected to say and all this and do, and where do we put so much pressure on these little things that we kind of miss the bigger picture? And I think we do a lot of times. And so can we release some of that and focus on the bigger picture, which is how do we love God well? How do we love our neighbor well? How do we love ourselves well? And so, because that's really the heart of the law of Torah is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's at the heart of the law of Torah. So Jesus kind of hammers them back and gets them back with that. And that's something for us to think about in today's time. And so, so as we go on into 15, we see this interaction between Jesus and a woman. Now, this is a challenging interaction. This is where Jesus doesn't show up well. And I read where somebody said, this could be a moment where Jesus kind of has his compassion down, has his grace down, isn't super merciful. This is where I think we see a little more of Jesus' human side. We get so caught up in his divinity, but this is a chance where we see him on his human side. And we see where Jesus is not at his best. That's why sometimes people say, well, Jesus is perfect. Is he? Because this is not a perfect Jesus here. This is a human Jesus. This is a Jesus that knows us and can relate with us and acts like us and behaves like us. This is a Jesus that we even say, hey, man, you weren't very good here. So this woman, asks him a question. He just kind of says, pushes her off to the side, uses this kind of a term, almost like calls this thing of a dog, and it has kind of a different connotation in that day than what maybe it does now, but it still was not a wonderful interaction. And so a couple things we kind of learned from this. One, the woman was persistent in her faith, and it changed and won Jesus over. And there's some thoughts around that, Jesus has stated earlier, he came for the lost sheep of Israel. Did Jesus now learn that he is here for everybody due to this woman? That you're not just for the lost sheep of Israel, you're here for the Gentiles and the Jews and everybody around everywhere. So it's this really interesting interaction where you see maybe Jesus change a little bit. But her persistent faith wins him over. And what was wild about this is women are not allowed to approach Jewish men. And Jesus being Jewish, she wasn't allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. Whether you're a Gentile woman or a Jewish woman, you cannot go up and talk to a Jewish man. And she does. The only women that are allowed to do that are prostitutes. So she kind of violates this culture code to have this interaction with Jesus. Obviously, she believes in him and knows who he is, and it kind of shows this really human nature of Jesus, which I think is a wonderful thing. We'll move on into chapter 16. You'll get the interaction with Peter, where Jesus has this great interaction with Peter and tells Peter he will be the rock on which he will build his church. But we also know Peter isn't perfect. Peter will have some issues and won't be at his best. But he will own up to it and will work to do what's right. And then they're a great lesson for us. And you will also see one of the first of the three passions being taught, starting in verse 21, where Jesus starts to predict his death and that. So this is one of the first of the three in the book of Matthew. As we get into chapter 17, you'll get into the transfiguration of Jesus. This is a parallel between Moses on Mount Sinai, where Moses had also transfigured. And this is important for the Jewish audience. They will recognize this. They see this, and this also lends more authority to Jesus being that authoritative interpreter of Scripture, which is very important to the Jewish people and to the readers and the hearers of this gospel. And this also, one of the things we can also learn from this is something that Peter does. Peter does kind of two things here. It's interesting. When Jesus is up on the mountain and he transfigures, and there's Elijah and Moses, he wants to pitch three tents, right? And that's the first problem. He's trying to put Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah, and Jesus doesn't go there. The second issue we have is Peter is busy doing and not listening. And we can all have that issue where we just want to get after the work. But there's a time of just be present with Christ, be present with Jesus, be present with God, and just listen and pay attention. And Peter kind of misses that because he just wants to hurry up and get to work. So that's something for us to kind of acknowledge in our own ways. When do we do that? When do we do that ourselves? When do we just need to slow down and just listen to the voice and just listen and absorb the word, right? So it's a great little lesson for us. In chapter 18, this is a good teaching block about for the coming church community of who they're going to be, a community that cares for the least, cares for the little, cares for the lost. And so this is an important little block here that gets taught. And then you get to chapter 19 around divorce. So this is an interesting one. This is a major one that people will usually turn to. So a couple things going on. One, you have to understand Jesus is working inside his own tradition. He's not talking about how divorce works in 2025. It's inside his own tradition and how they went about things. And so Jesus kind of does a couple things here. One, he does a good job protecting women in this instance, right? Because women were the only ones who could commit adultery. Men could not. Women could not ask for divorce. Men could, and for any reason whatsoever. And so here Jesus kind of flips it back to the guys and says, you can't just divorce women anymore, because it just leaves them vulnerable, unsafe, unprotected, along with their children. And so no longer was that going to be allowed. And it's kind of a sign of way in which Jesus is able to uphold the traditions in a way, but also reframe them and to kind of push them forward and progress them forward into some new ways. And so Jesus does this here. Now, some people have used this as a statement about who is allowed to get married, only male and female, only men and women. Jesus is not addressing marriage. He is addressing divorce based on the marital context of that day. What is interesting, at the end of this, he talks about eunuchs. So eunuchs are individuals that are neither male nor female. They're more like non-binary individuals. Some would even relate them to transgender individuals. Sometimes we don't want to quite go that far because it's not the same thing, but there is some relation to this, and what we could in some of our understandings. But we got to be careful pushing too close to that. However, they do not fit normal gender normatives, okay, in that time or even today. So be more like a non-binary person, but people can become eunuchs through castration. They can choose that. That's where we would kind of take a eunuch and somebody who's transgender, who maybe had like surgery, and say, hey, there's some similarities here. And Jesus lists them up, and he says that people are born like this, or they become this for the kingdom of God. These are people who do not get married, and it's okay to do this, and can be a way to show some really dedicated discipleship that's outside of maybe your normal everyday boundaries that was present. And so it's this powerful kind of image with the eunuchs that should really challenge us today, and to be more accepting about those who don't always fit our binary boxes, and how we understand how people can come in different forms, sizes, shapes, and ways, and still do the work of God. But it's also a great chance how Jesus protects vulnerable people in this moment through his declaration of what is right for divorce. So we'll get into then chapter 21. You have chapter 20. We'll go to chapter 21, though. Jesus enters Jerusalem. You see the cleansing of the temple here. This is a story that you'll find in all four Gospels. If there's a story that's in multiple Gospels, it's a very important story. So most likely also we can say historically that probably happened, being that it's in all four. So that always lends a lot more strength to those kinds of stories. Again, a moment where we see Jesus in some righteous anger. And then you also see this kind of interesting thing where Jesus talks about some parables, and the Pharisees kind of wake up and go, "Oh, wait, you're talking about us, aren't you? You're making fun of us, like you're ripping us," and they're not liking this too much. So, a really, really kind of a fun way that chapter 21 ends, in just kind of this aha moment the Pharisees have about this, and Jesus is being tough on them. Jesus is being real hard on them for sure. And then as we get in chapter 22, there's 4 questions that they use to hopefully trap Jesus to say the wrong thing. So then to give them more reason to arrest him and kill him and get rid of him. But he does a good job always navigating through that. So you can see ways in which Jesus navigates well through this. And maybe something for us to learn about too, and how we navigate tough questions. And even when we know people have bad intentions, how do we navigate through that and tend to uphold our own ethics and beliefs and not lower ourselves to the same kind of pettiness that even the Pharisees were bringing at that time. Chapter 23, Jesus kind of hammers back at the Pharisees here in this moment, some of the religious leaders, about they're not practicing what they're preaching, and we could probably all acknowledge that at times. So, we can feel that, but just being stronger about that, being stronger about practicing what we preach. But he even says, hey, listen to what they teach. They're not always going to do it right. And I think even for me as a minister, there's some truth to that. I try to be as good as I can. We all try to be as good as we can as religious people and leaders, but we're not always. And so hopefully people can learn from our mistakes when we make them, but we can also be given grace and also acknowledge that we need to give people grace too, because we ain't perfect. So verse 23, we get into here in chapter 23. This is where Jesus kind of tells and says that he is more concerned with the important matters of justice and mercy and faith. And this is kind of going back to when I talked about earlier, the reason why the Jewish leaders and the Pharisees are pushing these harder rules and laws on people to follow is they're really trying to increase the Jewish identity, which isn't a bad thing, right? Like they're really trying to strengthen it because they're feeling like the Greek culture is seeping in and taking away their identity as Jewish people and really, really threatening Judaism. And so to combat that, they're trying to adhere stricter and closer to their laws and practices. So their intent isn't bad, right? Like if we had to cut them a little bit of a break, we would probably do something similar. However, this is an important lesson for us. When we sense that happen, that doesn't mean we double down on our practices and traditions. It means we double down on our love and our grace and our mercy and faith to people, to be the best of the reflection of Jesus to others. That's how we strengthen our identity, not through rituals. And so I think that's something important for us to kind of look at. And chapter 23 also lists out 7 woes that Jesus talks about. And these are important. We can learn from these, and these are great ones to take little notes on and just kind of see like, hey, what do you think these are being talked about here? Because these are important woes. And again, Jesus is kind of lamenting in this moment over what he's seeing. Chapter 24 to 25. This is a great focus on like just waiting and being faithful and preparing and diligent. Why we can get caught up in work and to do. There's also a moment for that, for waiting and being faithful and just being prayerful in moments and preparing ourselves for what is to come. We need to prepare our table for our guests to arrive, right? And so what does that look like for us in our own faith and for our church as we prepare for the arrival of more people or prepare for a big practice or a big moment in our church life or our faith life, our own life? There is a part of preparation that we need to have, right? You don't You got to prepare for a vacation. You can't just hop in the car next day and just go. I mean, I guess you can, but a lot of times you got to have some kind of preparation, right, to know where you're going and what you're going to need and items you need to take. And so preparation is very important, and it is important for us in our faith life as well. As we move into chapter 26, you'll get the conspiracy to arrest Jesus. One interesting notes here that I think is where they're afraid to do it because the crowds are really getting fired up, and they are afraid of the crowds. And what do powerful people do when people like Jesus invoke crowds? They will do anything they can to silence them and not to stir more excitement. And this is a moment where we can see that, we may be more at times on the side of the powerful because we don't like the way the non-powerful are speaking up, way they're behaving, way they're acting. Even though they're screaming injustice, we're screaming lack of mercy, we're screaming the pain. Look at the pain you've caused us. But hey, we want to silence that. Oh, there's a right way to go about doing that. This isn't the way to do it. Well, Jesus kind of shows us. Yeah, I mean, he's just raising his voice. He's loving people, and people are getting fired up for it. And they're also calling out their oppressors and abusers, and the oppressors and abusers don't like that. So I hope this can be challenging for us, that when we see injustice and we see those really raising their voices, that we choose to side with them instead of always the oppressors, because Jesus is more on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. Because it isn't right. It's not right to be that, to be oppressed. And so let us acknowledge that and see that in the world, and let us lend our voices to that when those moments come up. You also get the Lord's Supper in this moment, and then you get the arrest and Peter's denial. As you move into chapter 27 and 28, this is where it ends. You get Jesus brought before Pilate. He gets crucified and dies in the resurrection. And that will end your reading in Matthew. So I hope you enjoyed the book of Matthew, and we'll move on to Mark next.